Vorrei semplicemente sottolineare due cose. La prima è quasi impossibile trovare, non solo tra gli economisti, ma in generale nelle scienze sociali, studiosi così eclettici. Se leggete molto semplicemente l'elenco dei più rilevanti saggi e dei libri pubblicati da Tyler, vedete subito il mosaico di un'intelligenza complessa e poliforme. Questo, nel nostro mondo soprattutto, che molto spesso tende a funzionare per compartimenti stagni, è una grandissima ricchezza. La seconda cosa che voglio aggiungere prima di lasciargli il microfono è che noi di fatto l'abbiamo invitato a presentare quello che oramai è il suo penultimo libro, The Great Stagnation. Però io il microfono glielo lascio esclusivamente se lui ci promette che in un altro contesto, quando saremo un po' più riposati, quando sentiremo meno la grande crisi dell'euro sul collo, verrà per parlarci invece del suo ultimo libro, che si intitola An Economist Gets Lunch, e che è un fenomenale libro di economia e di gastronomia, o perlomeno è un libro che riesce a spiegarvi l'economia attraverso l'esperienza quotidiana del cibo, della spesa, degli acquisti, di come è giusto interfacciarsi con i camerieri al ristorante, di come fanno i prezzi dei secondi rispetto a quelli dei primi, i diversi locali nei quali andate a cena. Per cui adesso parliamo di cose che ci fanno un pelino più paura. Quando, speriamo, non tra moltissimo tempo, ma chi lo sa, saremo forse un po' più rilassati, lo inviteremo per farci un discorso Bruno Leoni sui prezzi, sull'economia e sul cibo. Per intanto lo ringraziamo tantissimo di essere qua con noi e vi prego di dargli assieme con me veramente un caloroso benvenuto. So I basically said that we'd like to speak if you promise to come back to speak about the An Economist Gets Lunch.
Thank you for the very kind introduction, and I'd also like to thank all of you here who work with the Bruno Leoni Institute or who are supporters of it. I very much appreciate your efforts. I was talking with some journalists before this talk, and they were all trying to tell me I was a pessimist. So what I would like to do is try to convince you all that I'm not such a pessimist. I know up here the book says The Great Stagnation, and if I look down here, La Grande Stagnazione Globale, I think I know what that means. But nonetheless, I see considerable rays of hope. And I'm going to deviate somewhat from my prepared slides because all of these journalists, they asked me the same questions. So what I'm going to do is address those questions tonight. Let me start with a very basic point, but it is often forgotten. If I ask myself, what is mankind's greatest achievement ever? I submit to you, mankind's greatest achievement is Europe, Western Europe in particular, ever. Both the history of Western Europe, Verdi, Beethoven, Mozart, Picasso, but also Western Europe today, how people live. And I will tell you, very, very little of this achievement required the euro or the Eurozone. So I am very pessimistic about the Eurozone, but that is not the same as being pessimistic about Europe. But I think in Europe there has been what I call, along the lines of the French filmmaker Renoir, the grand illusion. And the grand illusion is this notion that European nations will become more unified, they will merge, they will have a common currency, they will have common finances, and that Europe will go down some planned utopian path, a path that would make Friedrich Hayek quake and fear in his boots. And that is the grand illusion. So my first report tonight is that the grand illusion is indeed an illusion. This will never happen. It will never work. People hear that I call this the grand illusion and they think I am a pessimist, but I am not. We do not need the grand illusion. It is precisely an illusion. One of the most dangerous, but also one of the greatest European innovations has been the idea of a nation state. And at least in today's world, mature nation states, they basically work. They have a monetary policy. They have a fiscal policy. They have elections. Canada, Australia, United States, many other countries, Japan, it works. What Europe has done is keep separate elections in every country, keep a separate fiscal policy, and try to have a common monetary policy. And this cannot work. You can go all the way, but I think with many different languages, with long histories of difference, with different cultures, you cannot have complete European integration. In the meantime, it is a recipe for a kind of temporary economic suicide to have a common monetary policy and separate electorates. Here's a very simple way to think about the problem. Let's say that you have some money and you live in the Eurozone and you want to put your money in a bank. How many of you today are taking your money and investing it in banks in Greece? How many of you think this is a wise investment? Probably none of you. The Greek economy is shrinking, so they can't even pay you a good return. And you're accepting a lot of risk. That's a very common sense point. But once you accept that point, it's easy to see the Eurozone, as it currently stands, cannot work. Because when some countries are revealed to be weak, their banking systems essentially collapse. So over the course of the last 2 years, about a third of the deposits in Greek banks have left Greece. This means deflationary pressure. It means loans dry up. It means the entire economy turns bad. You can try 20 different recipes. Cut government spending, deregulate this, restructure that. Sometimes this is the result. Sirens, right? But even if you don't need the sirens to put down a riot, you can do all those things. You can do them pretty well. But if your banking system is imploding, collapsing, none of it will work. It simply will not work. So the Eurozone worked great when all the economies were booming. It felt like a free lunch, but it simply cannot work when some economies appear weak. And there was this other mass delusion in Europe for about 10 years. There was a view that Greece, Portugal, Spain were almost as creditworthy as Germany, and we could lend to them at very low rates of interest. This again was a complete delusion, and that delusion now has unraveled. There is no way to get back to that other world. I'll offer a few predictions, but let me first say just a little about Italy. I'm an outsider to Italy, and all of you here know more detail about Italy than I do. But I have been many times. In the last 2 years, I think I have been 5 times. I was in Catania, Syracuse, Rome, Naples, Trentino. Now I am in Milan. Most parts of Italy I have visited. And it seems to me that although Greece is hopeless, Italy can solve all of its problems. Not all of its problems, but all of its fiscal problems. Furthermore, there are 3 different ways they can do it. This is good news, right? Not just one way, but 3 ways. Greece has no ways. Portugal probably has no ways. Let me present to you what I think are the 3 ways. I like some of them better than others. The first way is simply to have more babies. The short-term Italian position is not hopeless. What investors are worried about is the long-term Italian position. So right now, I think the fertility rate is about 1.4 in Italy. That means that in about 40 years' time, the population will be cut in half. If you think about what does this mean for the value of homes, what does it mean for the value of stocks, what does it mean for the government budget, what does it mean to support pensions, all of those things are impossible with a population which is being cut in half. So I know some of you came here perhaps to hear what to do about Italy, but you came to the wrong place. You should be out there doing something else very different right now, contributing your part. Part of the problem, I think, is this funny mix. In many of the Mediterranean countries, you still have a traditional notion of society, but you do not have traditional support networks for women who want large numbers of children. And it's this mix that you have some traditional mores, but not the traditional support networks, and not enough labor market flexibility. Same as in Japan. This mix tends to bring low birth rates. But nonetheless, to solve the Italian fiscal problem, you only need to do this one simple thing. People have done it for generations, right? So that's one solution. I would be very happy with that solution. There is no problem in Italy which cannot be cured by more Italians. The second solution also involves young people, and that is immigration. Italy could open itself up to immigration much, much more. I think this can be done selectively. It can be done critically. I do not believe in open borders. I think that is unworkable. But nonetheless, you can get young people from other countries, start with Asia, move to Latin America, and if you don't want to produce your own young people, they will come to you. That's solution number 2. I favor that also. Solution number 3, I do not favor, but I think it's useful for putting the problem in perspective. So if you read about Italy, you read about what is called the debt to GDP ratio. This compares the size of the debt to national income in a given year. And indeed, if you look at the debt to GDP ratio, for Italy, it looks scary, the number. It has 3 digits. It's scary. But in a way, that's the wrong number. If you want to be more optimistic, think about the ratio of debt to national wealth. Doing very rough, back-of-the-envelope calculations, my very rough estimate was that in Italy, the ratio of debt to national wealth is about 5%. And when you put it in those terms, it appears eminently workable. Italy is a very wealthy country. Private debt in Italy is quite low. Large numbers of families, they own their own homes. Human capital is high. There's an entire heritage, starting from antiquity, running up through almost every century. So the wealth here is very high. So here's a way to think about solving the Italian fiscal crisis. Again, I don't favor this. It's just putting it in perspective. If you simply tax 5% of wealth, the entire debt is gone. Completely gone. Now, of course, Italians do not like to pay taxes. I am personally suspicious of wealth taxes. I think they end up as a tax on excellence, as unfair, as a rewriting of the social contract. But again, just to put your debt problem in perspective, relative to your wealth, it is fairly small. What Italy needs is simply the will to solve the debt problem. So Italy has already 3 different paths out of the fiscal crisis. You may prefer some over the others, but the point is they are all possible. My fear is whether Italy will take these paths. I gave a talk in Rome last year, and my first point was this. The good news is that the quality of life in Italy is one of the best in the world. Everyone nodded. This was Rome. And then I said, the bad news is that the quality of life in Italy is one of the highest in the world. And that's exactly the problem. People here live very well. I don't just mean wealthy people. Most Italians, even in the poorer parts, they have good lives, strong relationships, a lot of meaning, a lot of culture. But when life is so good and you are heading toward a cliff, it is very hard for voters to step back and see the cliff and do something. So right now, Italy is taking none of these solutions. I have read the birth rate is going down a little. Immigration gets less popular in hard times. We will see. There are some indirect attempts to tax wealth. But again, in my view, the point is not to tax the wealth. The point is simply to have the will to see the wealth and have the will to solve the fiscal problem. And that's not really here. Many people in the United States were very happy when Monti became the leader of Italy, because all of a sudden here was this smart man, a technocrat. There was a view, he spoke our language. But from my point of view, Monti doesn't really matter. I mean no insult to Monti, but there was no election, there is no mandate, it is a temporary government, and if you think about the problems of Italy, so many of them are in the town, they are local, they are provincial, they are municipal, they are decentralized. Italy is a late nation state. It is a country varied. It is a country with a lot of local autonomy, a lot of local practices. So the Monti solution, no matter what you think of him, that is top-down. And in my view, as an outsider, what Italy needs is some solution which is bottom-up, at the local level, at the provincial level, at the family level. Basically, having some new kind of imagination to see how the wealth of Italy can be tapped to sustain a bright future. And again, while I do not see that necessarily happening, it is quite possible for Italy. Now let me get a little more pessimistic again. Let's go to Greece. Greece, I think, is in some ways currently economically hopeless. There was an election yesterday. The extreme parties command a majority. They may have another election in a few weeks' time. I think in essence there is now no coherent government in Greece. There is no consensus what to do. There is no popular support for any particular direction. There is simply discomfort and anger and fear. So I predict that within the next year, Greece will essentially leave the euro and leave the eurozone. It will not be that you wake up in the morning and see a headline, Greek government announces it will leave the eurozone. This is unlikely. A lot of Greeks are quite happy with the idea of the euro in the abstract. I think what will happen is that the euro will leave Greece before Greece leaves the euro. And I mean capital flight. Go back to this question I asked you before. How many of you want to invest your money in Greek banks? No one said yes. How many Greeks want to invest their money in Greek banks? Fewer every day. So the more that Greek government is chaotic, the more we will see capital flight from Greece, the more there will be deflation, the more credit will collapse, and one day the Greek government will wake up and instead of paying pensioners and employees with euros, they will pay them with IOUs, paper scrip. They will issue a note saying to a Greek employee, we owe you 300 euros, like a kind of check. And it will not be clear when you'll get your 300 euros for this note. A day will pass, 2 days will pass, people will realize the euros are never really coming. Some sarcastic fellow will hold up a piece of paper, an IOU, and call it a drachma. These IOU notes, the scrip from the government, they will start trading against the euro at some floating exchange rate. A week later, everyone will be calling these IOUs drachmas. And Greece will have a dual currency, but most euros will have left the country for fear of confiscation. And without any announcement, without any decision, the markets will rule, and in essence, Greece will have left the Eurozone. In the long run, this is probably better for Greece. In the short run, it will be traumatic. Things will get even worse. But you can imagine that 5 years from now, Greece will again recover and rebuild. So I think this will happen fairly soon. I think the next country to leave the Eurozone will be Portugal. They are paying very high rates on their bonds. They have a very serious productivity problem. In Portugal, the laws and regulations, they're very nice to little firms. They ignore you. And they're very nasty to big firms. They tax you, they regulate you, you can't fire people. So what's the incentive in Portugal? A lot of little firms. Portugal has nothing close to Italian productivity or competitiveness. It is better run than Greece, but ultimately I think it does not belong in the Eurozone. Portugal appears to be a country in some decline, no productivity gains. At some point, what happened to Greece will probably happen to Portugal, and Portugal too will leave. In the short run, it will be more pain, but 5 years down the road, they can regroup and rebuild, and they will probably never be very wealthy, but they will do okay. The key questions, of course, are Spain and Italy. Spain has very high unemployment, as you all know. Those numbers are not accurate. They do not pick up black market labor. But nonetheless, I think politically, this level of unemployment, you cannot sustain it for very long. So Spain, I think, weighs in the balance. They have more strengths than Greece or Portugal. They are not as strong as Italy. They have a political situation they cannot handle. They need to control the spending of the provinces, but the provinces are jealous of their authority. Spain has a lot of talent. It remains to be seen if Spain will stay. My best guess is that Spain will end up also leaving the Eurozone. But that, to me, is more of an open question. To skip ahead, here are my slides on Italy. Probably all of you know these. Here's Italy's GDP growth from 1960 to the current day. It could be a happier picture. Again, with Italy, you cannot completely trust the numbers because there's plenty of black market activity. But this is the problem. For Italy, it's a long-term problem, not a short-term problem. Here's another set of numbers. This is real GDP per capita income. Over the last 12 years, net per capita income in Italy has not grown. So this is la grande stagnazione d'Italia. 12 years is a long time. There's been an up, there's been a down. But people think more about Japan. And Japan has gone 25 years and only grown a little. So the fear with Italy is that this will continue. And that this will continue. And that's basically the cliff. Here's another scary picture. This is M3 in Italy, a broad measure of the money supply. Since 2009, it's basically falling off that cliff. So there's something about credit, something about intermediation, which in Italy is not working properly. There's an accumulation of imbalances. There's a lack of trust in Italian credit markets. And the fault is not the Italian banks. Italian banks have been conservatively run, responsibly run, it would be a big mistake to look at this and blame Italian banks. The problem is the broader macroeconomic setting. Once people started to doubt Greece, they started to doubt Portugal. Once people started to doubt Portugal, they started to doubt Spain. And then next in line is Italy, and there's a kind of disintermediation going on. So what does the Eurozone do? What does the European Union do? The European Central Bank at the summit steps up and they make a very bold decision. They say for 3 years, we will lend money to virtually any bank at 1%. This is a big boost to credit and lending and intermediation and liquidity. It's really an indirect or backdoor way of lending to governments. The European Central Bank has political and legal problems bailing out governments directly. But let's say a government is paying 6 or 7% in the credit market. You can't lend to the government, but you lend to the bank at 1%. The bank lends to the government and does an arbitrage, and so the rate the government has to pay falls from 6, 7% down 4, 5%, you hope down to 1%. If you're lucky, 3%, whatever, it falls. So that was a kind of stroke of genius in December, but it was a stroke of genius which failed. And the so-called stroke of genius, I think it didn't realize it was trying to support an arrangement which was impossible in the first place, namely a Eurozone with 17 very different nations in it. So that was December. That was a radical move. About €1 trillion were lent out, often on very weak collateral. €1 trillion, that's a lot, and a lot of it was to Italy. Here we are now in May. Even as of April, this arrangement was breaking down, and loan rates were going back up again. So we're in a position where €1 trillion worth of loans at 1% are not doing the trick. And we now have to face the question, what comes next? In a sense, all the alternatives look impossible. One alternative, this is what the French want, is for the Germans to financially guarantee or backstop the whole system. We could get into moral debates. Should the Germans do it? Are they obliged to do it? Have the Germans benefited so much from the Eurozone they should do it? Those are interesting debates. But my perspective is more practical. I think there is no chance the Germans will do this at all. Whether they should, whether you want them to, it won't happen. They will never say no, but this is what the Germans will do. They will agree in principle, and then they will say yes, but if we do this, we need some way to control the budgets of Spain, Portugal, Greece, possibly Italy. They will put conditions which are impossible. And Greece, Spain, Portugal will not agree. They will not agree to the Germans controlling their budgets. Maybe they should. Maybe the Germans would do a much better job. Quite possible. But again, to be pragmatic, they will not agree. And so the Germans will not backstop them. And everyone will say they favor this, but we will continue to bicycle toward the cliff. So that's one thing that people keep on talking about, like a Eurobond or collective bank resolution. There are many different trick ways of describing the scenario where the Germans bankroll everything. It's amazing how many tricky ways we have of describing that simple process. Germans pay for everything. They should just call it that. But they know if they call it that, it means it won't happen. But German voters are not stupid. They're simply not going to do this. No matter how clever the trick, in my opinion, that will not happen. So if that cannot happen, what else is possible? You could have the view that we must preserve the Eurozone at all costs and just try to stretch out more bailouts, IMF a bit more, call up China, beg to Brazil, more tricks, kick the grenade down the road a bit. And you could try to keep everyone, except maybe Greece, in the Eurozone another 20 years. But the notion that you will take countries and impose 20 years of deflation on them, 20 years of collapsing credit markets, this could happen, but I think it's a very bad outcome. Another possibility is the European Central Bank could either rewrite its charter or simply act illegally and monetize all this debt. That's actually another way of describing the solution. The Germans pay for everything. So have inflation, have high inflation, maybe 10% a year, and send all the new money to the troubled countries. Actually, that might solve the problem. It might be the best thing to do, I don't know. But again, you get back to, will the Germans do this? Should the Germans do it? What do the Austrians think? What do the Slovakians think? How does Finland feel? It's not just the Germans. A lot of countries that simply don't want to pay the bill. Slovakia is a much poorer nation, say, than Portugal. Why should Slovakia be paying the bill for Portugal? So high inflation, it's a possible way out, but it boils down to just a huge transfer. And at the end of the transfer, there's no guarantee you won't have the same problem again in a few more years. So my best prediction will be that at least two countries, Greece and Portugal, will leave, possibly 4, Spain and Italy, possibly 5 with Ireland. But of those countries, Italy has the most breathing room. It has the most productivity. It has the most competitiveness. The danger for Italy is less this immediate crack-up, but just this stagnazione. To go back to this picture, death by 1,000 cuts. Even if you look at the dynamic sectors in Italy, you can see some problems. So think about areas where Italy is strong, like fashion, or shoes, or wine, or food, or design. There's a lot of these areas. Let's say you want to buy the nicest kitchen tiles in the world. Where should you go? Probably Italy. Ice cream, many things. But these tend to be older sectors. Successful Italian firms, they're often fairly small. They're often family firms. So the father, the sons, the daughters, they work together. They're very productive, dedicated to quality, fantastic world-class firms all over Italy, especially in the north. But here's the thing, with family firms, you're very strong in old sectors, very new sectors, like writing apps for Apple products. You don't have family firms, because 70-year-old Papa, he's no expert at that. Maybe he's great at making wine or cooking food, but in new sectors, family firms don't really exist. It's young people. So Italy is underusing young people, and Italian family firms are best suited for the old economy. They're less well suited for the new economy, and they have a hard time scaling, precisely because they're family firms. So American firms, Swedish firms, German firms, they're all better at scaling. So even some of Italy's largest successes, the sizes of those successes are somewhat limited. And this is a cautionary note. People focus on the problems, say, in South Italy. Those problems are real. But another problem is simply caps, implicit caps on the sizes of many of the very best Italian firms. So just to sum up, I do think in a lot of ways the Eurozone is hopeless. It can exist as a small core of central countries, Germany, Austria, Netherlands, whatever. It probably will. That's fine. It can work fine. Very similar countries. Right now, Europe has a crisis of the imagination. People told themselves this picture, the grand delusion. Let's just look at 2 monies here. This shows to me the crisis of imagination. Do you all recognize this money? Whose face is on it? Where is that building? It's a total cipher. Imagine you try to get all the 17 Eurozone countries to agree whose face goes on these notes. It's hard to do. You look at these notes, you see the problem. Failure of imagination. There is no vision on these notes. and it has caught up with us. You look at these notes. You've probably seen a few of these. Swiss franc, Giacometti, Honecker, ARP. Great Swiss figures. They used to have Euler on the note. Plenty of Swiss heroes. Pretty much everyone in Switzerland is proud to have them on the notes. There is no failure of imagination when you look at the Swiss franc. So it's the difference between this and this which represents the crisis of imagination in Europe today. Let's all hope that we can solve that. And thank you for all coming and listening.